December 7th, 1941, 7:48 a.m. The Hawaiian sun rises over Pearl Harbor, casting golden light across the still waters of the Pacific. Moored in neat rows along Ford Island are 7 of America's most powerful battleships: the USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma, the USS West Virginia. Symbols of American naval might, resting peacefully in what seems an impenetrable fortress. But north of the island, hidden beyond the horizon, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers have spent the night closing the distance. At this moment, 183 planes are already airborne, skimming low over the ocean waves. Their pilots have trained for months for this single mission. Their target: the destruction of the United States Pacific Fleet. In less than 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans will be dead. The United States will be at war, and the world will never be the same. This is the story of how that morning came to be, and what happened when the first bombs began to fall. For Japan, the road to Pearl Harbor began not in 1941, but decades earlier. In 1905, the Japanese Navy achieved what seemed impossible, annihilating the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. It was the first time an Asian power had defeated a European empire in the modern age. For one young officer aboard those ships, a 21-year-old named Isoroku Yamamoto, the lesson was clear. A surprise attack, executed with precision, could destroy an enemy before they had time to respond. By the 1930s, Japan had transformed itself into an industrial power with imperial ambitions. They invaded Manchuria in 1931, then China in 1937. The war in China became a brutal quagmire, consuming resources and lives. In Nanking, Japanese troops committed atrocities that shocked the world. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were murdered. The images and stories that reached America turned public opinion decisively against Japan. But Japan pressed on, driven by a desperate need for resources. The island nation had almost no oil, no rubber, no tin. Everything needed to fuel their war machine had to be imported, and 80% of that oil came from the United States. By 1940, Japan faced a choice. The European powers were consumed by war with Nazi Germany. France had fallen. Britain was fighting for survival. Their colonies in Southeast Asia, rich with oil and rubber, lay virtually undefended. Japan could seize them, but this meant confronting the United States. In July 1941, Japanese troops moved into French Indochina. President Franklin Roosevelt's response was swift and devastating. He froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Then came the embargo. No more oil, no more steel, no more scrap metal. For Japan, it was an economic death sentence. At current consumption rates, they had perhaps 18 months of oil reserves remaining. After that, their military would grind to a halt. Their economy would collapse. The Japanese saw only 3 options: withdraw from China and Southeast Asia entirely, abandoning years of conquest and sacrifice, negotiate a compromise with the Americans, or go to war, seize the Dutch East Indies oil fields by force, and destroy anyone who stood in their way. Withdrawal was unthinkable. The military would never accept it. So Japan tried negotiation. Prince Fumimaro Konoe, the prime minister, desperately sought a face-to-face meeting with Roosevelt. He believed he could reach a compromise. But American Secretary of State Cordell Hull demanded Japan first withdraw all troops from China. Completely. Immediately. The Japanese military refused. They had spent a decade building their empire. 1 million men were fighting in China. They would not surrender at all before negotiations even began. In October 1941, Konoe resigned in despair. His replacement was General Hideki Tojo, the war minister, a hardliner, a man who believed in Japan's divine right to rule Asia. Final negotiations dragged through November. The Japanese offered concessions: withdrawal from southern Indochina, no further expansion, a pledge to seek peace in China. Hull rejected it all. On November 26th, he delivered an ultimatum: withdraw from China entirely, or there would be no deal. To the Japanese, it was a declaration of war in all but name. The Americans, they believed, were simply stalling for time, building up their Pacific forces while strangling Japan with sanctions. On December 1st, 1941, Emperor Hirohito gave his approval. Japan would go to war. But the plan had been in motion for months. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was perhaps the most unlikely architect of war with America. He had studied at Harvard. He had lived in Washington as a naval attaché. He spoke English fluently. He loved poker, bridge, and American movies. He understood American industrial power better than any man in Japan, and he knew Japan could not win a long war. In the first 6 to 12 months of war with the United States and Britain, he told Prince Konoe, "I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." Yamamoto's calculations were stark. America produced 20 times more steel than Japan, 100 times more oil, 5 times more aircraft. The American workforce was 5 times larger. In overall war potential, the ratio was 10 to 1. If Japan fought a traditional war, a war of attrition, they would lose, inevitably, completely. So Yamamoto proposed something radical. Don't wait for the Americans to bring their fleet across the Pacific. Don't fight them in Japanese waters. Strike first. Strike hard. Destroy their fleet before the war even begins. His target, Pearl Harbor. The idea was audacious. Pearl Harbor lay 3,700 miles from Japan, across the largest ocean on Earth. No one had ever launched a carrier strike at such range. The logistics seemed impossible. The risks were enormous. If the attack failed, if the carriers were discovered and destroyed, Japan would lose the war in a single day. But Yamamoto was convinced it was Japan's only chance. The plan drew inspiration from an unlikely source. In November 1940, British torpedo bombers had attacked the Italian fleet at Taranto Harbor. Using obsolete biplanes, they had crippled multiple battleships in a surprise night attack. The harbor was shallow. The Italians had believed torpedo attacks were impossible. They were wrong. Pearl Harbor was also shallow, averaging 40 feet in depth. Standard aerial torpedoes plunged to 100 feet or more before leveling off. They would simply bury themselves in the mud. But Japanese engineers found a solution. They fitted wooden attachments to the torpedoes, stabilizing fins that kept them shallow after release. It worked. In tests, the modified torpedoes ran true in less than 40 feet of water. Yamamoto assembled his strike force, 6 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, the largest carrier force ever assembled. Together, they embarked over 400 aircraft. Escorting them were 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. The commander of this fleet, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, was experienced but cautious. He had doubts about the operation. What if they were discovered? What if the American carriers weren't in port? What if this provoked America into a war of annihilation? Yamamoto had considered all of it, and still, he believed there was no alternative. To gather intelligence, Japan sent a spy to Hawaii. Takeo Yoshikawa posed as a diplomat, but spent his days touring Oahu. He watched Pearl Harbor from restaurants overlooking the water. He hired tourist planes to photograph the base from above. He even posed as a worker and walked through the naval base itself, noting ship positions, fuel tank locations, and the daily routine of the fleet. The security was laughably lax. No one questioned the Japanese man with the camera. No one suspected. Yoshikawa's reports went back to Tokyo. They revealed that American battleships moored in pairs along the southeast shore of Ford Island every weekend. They revealed the locations of airfields, fuel depots, and repair facilities. Most importantly, they revealed that the harbor's torpedo nets had been removed. The Americans believed the harbor was too shallow for torpedo attacks. By late November, the plan was finalized. The Kido Butai, as the strike force was called, would sail far to the north, through rough seas that were rarely patrolled. They would maintain total radio silence. They would refuel at sea from tanker ships. On the morning of December 7th, they would launch 2 waves of aircraft. The first wave would achieve total surprise, destroying aircraft on the ground and striking the battleships. The second wave would finish what the first began. The primary targets were America's 3 aircraft carriers: the USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga. Yamamoto knew that carriers, not battleships, would dominate the coming war. Sink the carriers, and America would be crippled for a year or more. Long enough for Japan to fortify their conquests, long enough to force America to negotiate peace. On November 26th, the same day Hull delivered his ultimatum, the Kido Butai sailed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. The Japanese officers gathered their men and revealed, for the first time, their target. A cheer went up from the crews. Pearl Harbor, the heart of American power in the Pacific. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who would lead the air attack, addressed his pilots. "The rise or fall of our empire depends upon this battle. Every man will do his duty." They sailed into the North Pacific, into winter storms and gray seas. For 12 days, they saw nothing. No American ships, no American planes. The ocean was empty. In Washington, American codebreakers intercepted fragments of Japanese messages. Something was coming. Something big. But where? Most expected the Philippines. Some thought British Malaya. Almost no one seriously considered Hawaii. On December 6th, the Kido Butai reached its launch point, 230 miles north of Oahu. The seas were rough. Waves crashed over the carrier decks, but the weather was clearing. Nagumo asked his officers one final time, should they proceed? The answer was unanimous, yes. That evening, crews painted rising sun symbols on aircraft fuselages. Pilots wrote final letters home. Mechanics checked engines one last time. At midnight, the Kido Butai turned south toward Hawaii. In Pearl Harbor, it was Saturday night. Sailors were on shore leave, drinking in Honolulu bars, enjoying the last evening of peace. On the ships, skeleton crews stood watch. No one expected anything unusual. At 3:42 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward detected a submarine attempting to enter Pearl Harbor. It fired, sinking the vessel. The report went up the chain of command. But in the chaos of messages and unclear protocols, no alarm was raised. At 6 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft began taking off from the carriers. 183 planes, 43 fighters, 49 high-altitude bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 40 torpedo bombers. Commander Fuchida led them south, through the dawn. At 7:02 a.m., 2 Army radar operators at Opana Point, Privates Joseph Lockard and George Elliott, detected something on their screens. A massive blip. Aircraft. Lots of them. Over 130 miles north and closing fast. They called it in to the information center. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler took the call. He knew a flight of B-17 bombers was expected from California that morning. He assumed that's what the radar had detected. "Don't worry about it," Tyler said. The operators shut down their station and left. At 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese planes appeared over the north shore of Oahu. The planes came in low over the mountains, emerging from the clouds like a sudden storm. Below them, the island of Oahu spread out in the morning sun. Green mountains, white beaches, and there, glinting in the harbor, the gray shapes of the Pacific Fleet. Commander Fuchida looked down from his bomber and could hardly believe what he saw. The battleships were all there, moored in neat rows. No torpedo nets, no barrage balloons, no fighters in the air. The Americans had no idea they were coming. Fuchida raised his signal flare gun and fired once. The attack was on. Then he fired again. The second flare meant they had achieved complete surprise. His radio operator tapped out 3 short bursts. 2, 2, 2. The first syllable of Totsugeki Seiyo, charge. Then he sent the message that would echo through history. Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, tiger, tiger. Total surprise achieved. Far to the north, aboard the carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo received the message and allowed himself a slight smile. Yamamoto's gamble was working. The Japanese aircraft split into groups, each with assigned targets. The dive bombers and fighters peeled off toward the airfields. Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Bellows Field, Kaneohe Naval Air Station. The torpedo bombers and high-altitude bombers continued toward Pearl Harbor and Battleship Row. On the ground, confusion reigned. At Wheeler Field, Second Lieutenant Robert Overstreet was shaving when he heard explosions. He looked out his window and saw planes swooping low over the base, dropping bombs. They had red circles on their wings. "They're Japs!" someone shouted. Overstreet ran outside in his underwear. Planes were parked wingtip to wingtip on the airfield, bunched together as protection against sabotage. The Japanese dive bombers strafed them methodically. Within minutes, dozens of American aircraft were burning. Lieutenant Philip Rasmussen sprinted to one of the few undamaged P-36 fighters. He was still wearing his purple pajamas. He managed to take off, climbing into the chaos of aircraft swarming over the island. His guns jammed almost immediately, but he kept flying, trying to draw fire away from other American planes struggling to get airborne. At Hickam Field, a formation of B-17 bombers from California was approaching for landing at the exact moment the attack began. The crews, unarmed and low on fuel after their long flight, found themselves flying through a firestorm. Japanese fighters pounced on them. Some B-17s managed to land, others crashed. The crews who survived stumbled from their aircraft in shock, unable to comprehend what was happening. But the real devastation was unfolding at Pearl Harbor. The harbor was shaped like a keyhole, with a narrow entrance opening into a broad expanse of water. Along the southeast side of Ford Island, the 7 battleships of the Pacific Fleet were moored. From north to south, the Nevada, the Arizona, the Tennessee, the West Virginia, the Maryland, the Oklahoma, and the California. They were the pride of the American Navy. Each displaced over 30,000 tons. Each carried massive 14-inch guns capable of hurling shells 20 miles. They were symbols of American power, seemingly invincible. At 7:55 a.m., the torpedo bombers arrived. They came in low and fast, skimming just 50 feet above the water. The modified torpedoes dropped away, splashing into the harbor. For a few seconds, they disappeared beneath the surface. Then they ran true, streaking toward their targets. The USS Oklahoma took the first hit on its port side. The explosion tore a massive hole in the hull. Water rushed in. Then a second torpedo hit, and a third. The ship began to list. On deck, sailors scrambled to their battle stations. Many were still in their underwear, having been asleep below decks. Alarms blared. Officers shouted orders. But the ship was already dooming. A fourth torpedo struck, then a fifth. The Oklahoma was rolling over. Seaman Stephen Young was trapped below decks as the ship capsized. The lights went out. Water poured in. The deck became a wall, then a ceiling. He and 31 other men found an air pocket in what had been a pump room. They waited in the darkness, the water slowly rising, listening to the muffled sounds of explosions outside. Some prayed. Some wept. Some wrote final messages to their families on scraps of paper. Above them, the Oklahoma's hull rose out of the water, its barnacle-covered bottom exposed to the sky. Over 400 men were trapped inside. Only 32 would be rescued alive. The rest drowned in the darkness. The USS West Virginia, moored outboard of the Tennessee, took 6 torpedo hits in rapid succession. The ship's captain, Mervyn Bennion, was killed instantly by shrapnel from a bomb that struck the nearby Tennessee. Executive Officer Thomas Beatty took command, but there was little he could do. The ship was sinking. Ensign Victor Delano realized they could save the ship from capsizing by counter-flooding, deliberately flooding compartments on the starboard side to balance out the flooding on the port side. It worked. The West Virginia settled upright onto the harbor bottom, rather than rolling over like the Oklahoma. As the ship sank, sailors abandoned ship, jumping into water that was coated with burning oil. Many never surfaced. The USS California, moored alone at the south end of Battleship Row, took 2 torpedo hits. The ship had been preparing for an inspection, and many of its watertight doors were open. Water flooded through the ship. It began to settle slowly into the mud. But the worst was yet to come. High above the harbor, the level bombers of the Japanese first wave were making their attack runs. Unlike the torpedo bombers, which flew low and fast, these aircraft operated at 10,000 feet, dropping armor-piercing bombs converted from 16-inch naval shells. The bombs weren't designed to penetrate the ship's armor plate directly. Instead, they would smash through the wooden decks and detonate deep inside the ships, where the armor was thinner. At 8:06 a.m., one of these bombs struck the USS Arizona near the forward gun turret. What happened next was catastrophic. The bomb penetrated the deck and detonated in or near the forward ammunition magazine. Over 1 million pounds of gunpowder exploded in an instant. The forward part of the ship simply disintegrated. A massive fireball erupted 500 feet into the air. The blast was so powerful it lifted sailors off the decks of nearby ships. Windows shattered in Honolulu, 10 miles away. The Arizona's hull broke in 2. The forward section collapsed. The massive forward gun turret, weighing over 1,000 tons, fell into the inferno. Burning fuel oil spread across the water, engulfing men who had jumped from the ship. Radio man Glenn Lane was in the communications room when the bomb hit. The blast knocked him unconscious. When he came to, the room was filling with water and smoke. He found a porthole, squeezed through it, and swam through burning oil to shore. Over 2,100 men aboard the Arizona died in the explosion and its aftermath. It took less than 9 minutes for the ship to sink. The Arizona's band was scheduled to play Morning Colors at 8 a.m. All 21 members of the band died in the explosion. Most were never identified. Inside the capsized Oklahoma, the trapped sailors were fighting for their lives. The air pocket they had found was maybe 10 feet across. The water had risen to chest height and was still climbing. Seaman Julio de Castro took charge. Using a wrench, he began pounding on the hull in Morse code, hoping someone outside would hear. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. SOS, over and over. Outside, rescue crews were trying to determine if anyone was alive inside the overturned hull. They heard the pounding. They began cutting through the thick steel with acetylene torches. It was delicate, dangerous work. Cut in the wrong place, and seawater would flood in, drowning the survivors. Cut too slowly, and they would suffocate as the air ran out. In the darkness, the trapped men could hear the cutting torches. The sound gave them hope. But the water kept rising. After hours of cutting, the rescue crews broke through. One by one, the men squeezed through the opening. 32 men survived this way. But time ran out for others. In another compartment, searchers later found 4 bodies. The men had lived for days in the darkness, slowly suffocating. Next to them was a calendar with days crossed off. The last mark was on December 23rd, 16 days after the attack. Of all the battleships in harbor that morning, only one managed to get underway, the USS Nevada. The Nevada had been moored alone at the north end of Battleship Row. When the attack began, the ship's senior officer aboard was Ensign Joseph Taussig, a 22-year-old who had only been on the ship for a few weeks. The first torpedo hit the Nevada's bow, blowing a massive hole in the hull. But the ship's boilers were already lit for morning operations. Chief Boatswain Edwin Hill, who had been on the dock, saw his ship was in danger. He ran aboard and cast off the mooring lines himself, then dove into the harbor and swam back to shore as the ship began to move. The Nevada headed for the harbor entrance, hoping to reach open water. It was a bold move. If they could escape, they might survive. If not, at least they wouldn't be trapped in the harbor. Japanese pilots spotted the moving ship and converged on it. If they could sink the Nevada in the narrow channel, they could bottle up the entire Pacific Fleet. Bombs rained down. One struck near the forward gun turret, killing Ensign Taussig and most of his gun crew. Another hit the bridge, killing or wounding most of the officers there. The ship was on fire in multiple places, but it kept moving. Admiral William Furlong, watching from his flagship, realized the danger. If the Nevada sank in the channel, it would block the entrance completely. He sent an urgent message. "Nevada, beach yourself immediately. Do not block the channel." The Nevada's acting captain, Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, complied. At Hospital Point, he deliberately ran the burning ship aground. The Nevada was out of the fight, but the channel remained clear. Just as the first wave was departing, the second wave arrived. 170 aircraft, 54 level bombers, 80 dive bombers, and 36 fighters. But this time, the Americans were ready. Anti-aircraft guns were manned and firing. Ammunition lockers were open. The element of surprise was gone. The dive bombers concentrated on the ships that were still afloat or partially afloat. They also targeted the harbor facilities, machine shops, fuel tanks, and the submarine base. The USS Pennsylvania, in dry dock for maintenance, took bomb hits that killed dozens of men. The destroyers Cassin and Downs, in the same dry dock, were hit and burned fiercely. The second wave met fierce resistance. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Japanese planes were hit and went down trailing smoke. Some pilots, their aircraft damaged, deliberately crashed into targets kamikaze style, though these were individual decisions, not organized tactics. By 9:45 a.m., it was over. The last Japanese plane disappeared into the clouds. The harbor fell silent except for the roar of fires and the cries of wounded men. The scene was apocalyptic. Thick black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, visible from ships 100 miles at sea. The harbor was covered with oil, much of it on fire. Debris floated everywhere. Life jackets, wooden planks, pieces of aircraft, bodies. The USS Arizona was still burning. It would burn for 3 days. The Oklahoma lay upside down, its hull visible above the water like the back of a dead whale. Rescue crews were still cutting through the steel, trying to reach survivors. The West Virginia had settled to the bottom, its superstructure still above water. Inside, sailors were trapped in airtight compartments. Rescuers could hear them tapping on the hull, but they couldn't reach them. The tapping continued for 16 days, then stopped. The Nevada was beached and burning. The California was sinking slowly into the mud. The Maryland and Tennessee, protected by the ships moored outboard of them, were damaged but repairable. On shore, the hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses worked frantically on hundreds of wounded. They ran out of blood for transfusions. They ran out of bandages. They ran out of morphine. They performed surgeries on dining room tables, in hallways, anywhere they could find space. The young sailor from the Oklahoma, Stephen Young, emerged from the darkness after 25 hours trapped inside the hull. His skin was wrinkled and white from the water. He was covered in oil. He could barely walk, but he was alive. Lieutenant Philip Rasmussen, still in his purple pajamas, landed his damaged P-36 fighter. Ground crews counted 18 bullet holes in the aircraft. His roommate, also a pilot, was dead. At Wheeler Field, crews counted the losses. 83 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair. At Hickam, 34. At Kaneohe, 33. Across all bases, 188 American aircraft were destroyed. Another 159 were damaged. In the harbor, the losses were staggering. 4 battleships sunk: the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, the California. 4 battleships damaged: the Nevada, the Maryland, the Tennessee, the Pennsylvania. 3 cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers destroyed. Multiple support ships sunk or damaged. But the most important number was this: 2,403 Americans dead, 1,178 wounded. Of those killed, 1,177 were on the Arizona. The ship became their tomb. But amid the devastation, there were crucial failures in the Japanese attack. The most important, all 3 American aircraft carriers were at sea and undamaged. The Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. The Lexington was en route to Midway. The Saratoga was in California for maintenance. Yamamoto had wanted those carriers destroyed above all else. They would prove to be the decisive weapons of the Pacific War. The Japanese also failed to strike the harbor's fuel storage tanks. Massive above-ground tanks held over 4.5 million barrels of oil. If they had been destroyed, the Pacific Fleet would have had to withdraw to California, extending the war by months or years. The submarine base was untouched. American submarines would go on to devastate Japanese shipping, strangling their empire. The repair facilities at Pearl Harbor remained operational. Ships that seemed destroyed were raised, repaired, and returned to service. The West Virginia, which sank on December 7th, would return to action in 1944 and participate in the liberation of the Philippines. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai, made the decision not to launch a 3rd wave. His pilots were exhausted, American defenses were alert, and most importantly, he had no idea where the American carriers were. For all he knew, they were closing in on his fleet at that moment. It was a cautious decision. It was also a mistake. In Washington, it was mid-afternoon when the news arrived. President Franklin Roosevelt was in his study with advisor Harry Hopkins when Navy Secretary Frank Knox burst in. "Mr. President, the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor." Roosevelt's face went pale. Then it hardened. Hopkins thought there must be some mistake. Japan wouldn't be that foolish. But the reports kept coming. The damage was worse than anyone imagined. The Pacific Fleet had been crippled in a single morning. Roosevelt called in his cabinet. He summoned military leaders. Throughout the afternoon and into the evening, they assessed the situation. The reports grew more dire with each update. That night, Eleanor Roosevelt had her regularly scheduled radio broadcast. She spoke to an anxious nation. "We know what we have to face, and we know we are ready to face it. Whatever is asked of us, I am sure we can accomplish it. We are the free and unconquerable people of the United States of America." Roosevelt worked late into the night, drafting his speech to Congress. He wrote it in pencil, making edits as he went. His secretary, Grace Tooley, typed it up. The next morning, December 8th, Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. The chamber was packed. Every senator and representative was present. The Supreme Court justices attended. The cabinet was there. Across the nation, families gathered around radios to listen. Roosevelt's voice was firm, clear, angry. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. He continued, "The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost." His words were few, but devastating in their impact. This was not a time for long explanations or diplomatic language. This was a declaration. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. The speech lasted 6 minutes. Congress voted to declare war on Japan. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only one dissenting vote. Jeannette Rankin, a pacifist from Montana who had also voted against entry into World War I. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, honoring their treaty with Japan. America was now fully committed to a two-ocean war. Across the country, young men flooded into recruitment centers. Lines stretched around blocks. Many had to be turned away. There were simply too many volunteers. The attack on Pearl Harbor had unified America in a way nothing else could have. The debate between isolationists and interventionists was over. The nation was at war, and there was no question about whether to fight. In Japan, the news of Pearl Harbor was received with celebration. Radio broadcasts announced a great victory. Newspapers ran headlines about the destruction of the American fleet. The emperor issued a statement praising the bravery of Japanese forces. But Admiral Yamamoto did not celebrate. When told of the victory, he reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He knew the carriers had escaped. He knew the war was only beginning. And he knew that Japan had perhaps 6 months before America's industrial might turned the tide. He was correct. 6 months later, in June 1942, the Japanese and American fleets met at Midway Island. The Japanese brought 4 of the carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. American dive bombers sank all 4 in a single day. Japan's naval air superiority was shattered. The tide of the Pacific War turned. From Pearl Harbor to Midway was 181 days. Yamamoto had predicted Japan would run wild for 6 to 12 months. His prediction was accurate almost to the day. In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Navy divers began the grim work of recovery. They searched through flooded compartments, cutting through twisted metal to reach the dead. It took months. The Oklahoma was eventually righted in 1943 using massive winches and cables. The process took 4 months. Inside, they found 415 bodies. Many were unidentifiable. They were buried in mass graves. The Arizona was deemed too damaged to salvage. The ship remains on the harbor floor to this day, with over 900 sailors still entombed inside. It leaks about a quart of oil per day, 73 years later. Survivors of the Arizona can choose to have their ashes interred in the ship when they die, rejoining their crewmates. The California, the West Virginia, and the Nevada were all raised, repaired, and returned to service. They would participate in the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They would bombard Japanese positions. They would survive the war. Of the 2,403 Americans killed at Pearl Harbor, 2,008 were Navy personnel, 109 were Marines, 218 were Army, and 68 were civilians. The youngest casualty was 18. The oldest was 62. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and 64 men. One Japanese submariner, Kazuo Sakamaki, was captured when his midget submarine ran aground. He became America's first Japanese prisoner of war. Years later, Sakamaki was asked how he felt about being the first prisoner. He replied, "I wanted to die. I had failed my emperor. I had failed my country. I had failed my mission." But he survived. After the war, he returned to Japan and became a successful businessman. He spent the rest of his life advocating for peace. Pearl Harbor was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological shock, a national trauma that united a divided country and propelled America into the most destructive war in human history. It was also an intelligence failure of staggering proportions. The signs were there: the radar contact, the submarine sighting, the intercepted messages, the spy reports, but no one connected the pieces. No one believed it could happen. The attack validated Yamamoto's tactical brilliance while exposing his strategic miscalculation. Yes, the surprise attack succeeded. Yes, it bought Japan time. But it also unleashed something Yamamoto had feared: American rage, American determination, American industrial power. By 1945, the United States had built 147 aircraft carriers. Japan built 17. The war that began at Pearl Harbor ended at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered unconditionally on September 2, 1945. Today, the USS Arizona Memorial straddles the sunken battleship. Over 1 million visitors come each year to stand above the wreckage and pay their respects. Oil still seeps from the hull. The names of the dead are carved into marble walls. December 7, 1941, remains a date that lives in infamy. Not because of the military defeat, but because of what it awakened: a nation's will to fight, to sacrifice, and ultimately to triumph over those who attacked without warning. The sailors of the Arizona, the Oklahoma, and all the ships of Pearl Harbor did not die in vain. They became the catalyst for victory. Their sacrifice will not be forgotten.